when I woke up, very confused. She said, "You almost died last night. In fact, no one can believe you were alive."
I went into the games not knowing what was coming.
As humans, we just hate uncertainty.
You just sensed that it was out there.
You have to start somewhere.
We're all programmed to push ourselves even farther.
This is On the X, an IRONCLAD original. Welcome to On the X. My guest today is Rhaina Cohen, an award-winning journalist, author, and one of the most thoughtful voices exploring how we connect, relate, and live together. Rhaina is a producer and editor for NPR's Enterprise Storytelling Unit, where she's worked on standout shows like Embedded, Invisibilia, and Rough Translation. Her reporting has examined everything from the Me Too movement to male friendship to the way we make complex decisions. In 2024, she published her debut book, The Other Significant Others, a national bestseller that explores deep, committed friendships that don't fit the mold of traditional romance, but often shape people's lives in equally profound ways. It builds on her widely shared 2020 Atlantic article, What If Friendship, Not Marriage, Was at the Center of Life, and asks us to rethink what makes a relationship central. Today, we talk about redefining intimacy, building chosen bonds, and why some of the most meaningful partnerships in life don't come with a wedding ring. So here we go with Rhaina Cohen on the X. So your book was really interesting. It's a subject that I suppose I have thought about sort of abstractly, but never really gone in depth on it in terms of the implications of this idea. The Other Significant Others is the name of the book, which is arresting in and of itself. I had to stop for a second and go, what does that mean, the other significant others? But you sort of quickly latch onto it, that it is a book about the relationships that matter the most to us and what defines those and how we categorize them in various ways, and the sort of stigmas that are built around those, and questioning a lot of these norms. So you relay in here your own personal relationship with a woman, you call her M in the book, as I suppose your own like way into this. But was it that relationship that got you interested in this concept in the first place, or were you interested in it prior to that?
I think I was generally interested in friendship beforehand. I mean, I can think about when I was 10 and planning a birthday party and just wanted to have the kind of perfect configuration of people. And I think I'm very interested in treating friendship as a significant relationship. But it did take this specific friendship that really broke for me what I thought of as the boundaries of what a friendship could be, that we were much more intertwined. We had a kind of level of affection, and there was a sort of excitement in our friendship that I had been told you really could only experience in a romantic relationship. So yes, it really did take that friendship to get me to start questioning, what do we think are the limits of friendship, and are those actually true? Right.
So for people that have not read the book, can you give a little context to that, like your relationship? Because I think a lot of us think we have, certainly as adults, we have a romantic relationship. And I want to get into what that means too, because I think that's another thing where I was like, I got to really question what that means to be in a romantic relationship. Is it just sex and a friend, or is there something that goes beyond that? Right. Mm-hmm. And you talk about that extensively, but I think for a lot of us, we think, okay, we've got our spouse or significant other, as per the title of the book. And then we have friends, and we may have a best friend, or we may have best friends at different portions of our life. And I would probably put myself in that category. But this is a situation where you sort of had somebody who wasn't your husband, wasn't a romantic relationship, but sort of almost went beyond best friend into some other category. So can you kind of just give people some context of what that was like, what that entailed for you?
To me, so my friend Em and I, for the first couple of years of our friendship, lived a 5-minute walk from each other. And that meant that we just could move between each other's houses in a way that I think you see in sitcoms, but not that often in sort of regular adult life.
Right.
So I would stop at her house on the way to the metro in the morning when I would commute to work, and we would have breakfast at her house. And I could tell you the recipes that she made most weeks, and she would adapt those recipes because I didn't like mushrooms, and like that we were factored in that way. And she would let me know when there were sales on avocados at the grocery store. We would bring +1s to each other's parties, and like she was always the person I wanted to talk to if I was reading something and I wanted to think through an idea or had some personal experience and kind of wanted to unpack it. I mean, it was like her presence and her mind that I wanted. And I think it's possible to have some of those elements with friends, but the fact that so much of that was packed into this person, who again was not a romantic partner, which I think many of the things that I described, people would say, well, like, yeah, you have routines with a romantic partner, or your romantic partner is your +1, or your romantic partner is your confidant or the person you go to. But instead I was finding that through her.
Right. So, and remind me too, did you have that friendship before you met your husband?
No, I was a couple years into my relationship with my now husband. And, we were long distance. So we were seeing each other every other weekend, which I think is one of the things that made it possible for, or I made it easier maybe to really develop this friendship, because I had extra space in my life that maybe if I'd been living with a partner, I don't know, it would have been easier to always go to him. So, but instead I kind of had more than one person who had this anchoring presence for me.
And how did that, so for people again out there that aren't familiar with the story here, and you get into other people's stories here, but just for you personally, how did that work with the three of them too? Because I think people's immediate reaction to something like that is, if I'm married to somebody and somebody else that's not a romantic interest, it's not an affair or something like that, is satisfying an emotional need for this person, I think there's a real tendency to be jealous about that, to say, hey, how come you're not getting that from me? And that's part of the stuff you're talking about in this book.
I think the question I would ask back is, why do you think you have to be everything to your partner?
Great question.
And do you really want that to be the expectation? Because I don't, that feels like you're going to fail. Or at least if I'm imagining that from my perspective. If my husband expected me to share every hobby that he did, that I am the go-to person for everything that happens in his life, that I am the person who's going to process everything emotionally with him, and that, that every single box I have to check, that just seems like a level of pressure that is unpleasant for that person on the receiving end. And so I guess I would first say, let's question this thing that we take for granted, which is that one person is supposed to fulfill all of your needs. And then if you're able to step back from that, then, you can ask these questions about well, why am I feeling competitive or assuming that there's jealousy, when really that there's an opposite interpretation, which is that having more than one close relationship can actually make all of them stronger. And I saw that in my own life. I mean, my husband and Em are very close, and they have a kind of independent friendship. And the three of us spend time together and get along really well. And then the people that I've interviewed who have both a romantic partner and a very close friend like mine, that I've been describing with Em, have found that those relationships are mutually reinforcing. That in one case, I can say this man was saying about his best friend that he gets to sort of workshop a lot with his best friend, so he's not dumping everything on his wife. And that's one version of it. Or I've seen situations where one person in this group of people is going through a crisis, and now there are two supports, and that's good both for the person going through the crisis and for the romantic partner who is not on their own and having to support the person that they love. So what I have seen is, there are cases of jealousy, and we can talk about that. But there are also cases of really the opposite. And when you entertain that, it makes you rethink what we hold up as the ideal for a romantic relationship.
Yeah. So I want to kind of go into that about the standard that we've created in people's minds, and is it realistic, or is it just asking too much of people? But before I get to that, just to kind of frame up the rest of this, is the rest of this book is you're talking to people, couples. I guess you would call them couples,
This-
partners, but I don't know what the
it's always
term
so funny.
is.
People
Right?
are like, "What do I call them?" I mean, it is hard. This is part of the project is like we don't have language, and the
Right, the
absence of
semantics are
language,
tricky.
is significant.
Yes. Right. So, and they're just in, this sounds degrading, but like sort of atypical type relationships, right? Where it's two women, or it's two men, or it's more than two people, or it's a very old couple that have decided that they're not married or anything, but they're going to live together, own a house or something like that. And the challenges that they navigate in this system that is basically set up to say, no, the right orientation is typically male, female, married couple with children potentially, or at least that's sort of the intent, so to speak. And we've certainly opened the aperture on that, but it's still, even if you go, okay, yes, but it's not just heterosexual relationships, it can be homosexual or other classification. It's still sort of like, yeah, but you should have a romantic person in your life that kind of fits that qualification. So let's kind of start there with that notion, that sort of premise or assumption. Where do we get that? And where is it potentially wrong? Because I think of the word that is always used at weddings, which is soulmate, right? It is, I have found my soulmate. I have found the one, is what we tend to say. And whether they're reading vows that have been written for their own, it's always just like, you're my best friend, you're my everything, you're this and you're that. And is that an unrealistic expectation? Is there something flawed in that thinking that we should be re-examining?
Well, so to answer that question and your earlier one about like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
If we rewound 300 years, this would have been an absurd idea that your romantic partner is supposed to be your soulmate. Marriage was primarily an economic institution. It's in-laws making strategic decisions. It's, like you are signing up for someone who you're going to run maybe a small business and a household with. And then you fast forward to mid 1800s and you start to see that it's more common for love to be not just a kind of bonus for marriage, but really what you would build a marriage around. And, the love match, basically. I think Jane Austen, when that's not just being pragmatic becomes common. And it's really only starting in like the 1960s that you see this language of soulmate and the idea of having your romantic partner as your best friend. The psychologist Eli Finkel talks about this as the self-expressive marriage. And basically, like, you don't just want to love your partner, but you want your partner to unlock the best version of you that's hidden from within, and you'll self-actualize. And what he says is, to your question of like, is this bad? He sees this as it kind of operates on extremes, that for some people, they are having better marriages than have ever existed before because they're finding really an exceptional match. I think that would have been really difficult in, let's say, the 1800s or, the early 1900s, when you have a relationship in heterosexual marriage where the woman is property of the man. When you have that kind of inequality, it seems pretty hard to have a relationship where that person's going to fulfill your emotional needs and your intellectual needs and all of that. So on the extreme end, he thinks that for some people it's really great, but for a lot of people, it's not working out so hot. So he calls it the all or nothing marriage. So I think it's worth really looking at what are the risks that we take when we set these expectations so high.
So is that true? Is it really? You wind the clock back a couple hundred years and it was not at all. Marriage was never about like two people who loved one another and felt like they couldn't live without the other person. It was never the case.
I mean, people have been writing love poems for, I think, thousands of years. It's not that love didn't exist and that it couldn't exist, but it wasn't a precondition for marriage. And, I think, like, when you read some of the some historical writings, there's the gulf between men and women, the way that they were socialized so separately, I think made it hard for the kind of intimacy that we now assume is going to be part of a marriage. And that instead, people found a lot of that intimacy with their friends, their same-sex friends. And you know, like one of the examples that I find quite striking is from the philosopher Montaigne. There's centuries ago, he wrote a famous, I believe it was an article called On Friendship. And he says that only men are capable of true friendship because women have this rash and wavering fire that's incompatible with true friendship. And that kind of speaks to the level of the assumptions about intimacy that are possible in same-sex relationships within friendships. That's just so different than the way that we think of them now.
Where did you find these people? Like, how did you find them? Did you put out a survey or something?
It was not easy. One thing that I did was sort of think about what are communities where I'm guessing these sorts of very close friendships are disproportionately likely to happen. And one of those was, I was like, well, the military is a place where I think people forge really intense bonds. And I contacted a friend of mine. So this is an example of something I did, but I contacted a friend of mine who's in the Navy, and she put, I think, a call out on Facebook and like immediately got some people there. I, ended up in a long conversation on a plane with somebody who was in the sort of recovery community, and she ended up putting me in touch with some people who were very close. I reached out to some senior centers because I figured like there's got to be some people who maybe are like no longer, survive their spouse or something, who have these close friendships. And those were some of the ways that I did it. It's such an, you have to know people pretty well to know that they have this kind of friendship, because there is no society for platonic partners or like PR person working for this. There's no term for it. So I had to kind of throw a lot of spaghetti at the wall and find a broker who knew people well enough to be able to identify, oh yes, this thing that you're talking about, I've seen this out in the world.
Okay. So going back to like the hundreds of years ago type thing. So what did people do? Okay. So if marriage was not by and large about love or anything like that, were people satisfying romantic desires, sexual desires, and just extramarital affairs, mistresses? I mean, to your point, largely patriarchal societies. What were people doing?
Well, I mean, there's a large sweep of history where, if you read the Bible, a lot of monogamy is not sort of taken for granted. So men especially would have multiple partners. I think you would see that. If you're looking at more recent history, some of the stuff is complicated because we don't totally know for sure. People weren't writing all this stuff down, but I think we can be very confident that a lot of the emotional connection that people were getting were through their friends. I mean, there are letters that you see, just norms of exchanging locks of hair. There are ceremonies around friendship. There is a ceremony that existed in the West up until about the 1800s, where men would go into a church together and put their hands on the Gospels and have a priest say blessing for them, and they would be turned into brothers for life, and sometimes afterwards. So there's all sorts of evidence that really looks at the ways that friends were very integral to people's lives. And I'm sure also beyond that, people were not necessarily put in these kind of nuclear family units where it would just be one person, you and your spouse and some kids. You would have your sisters and brothers and in your house or nearby, and your parents and your aunts and your uncles, and you'd have these and then people who maybe you're not related to, but you kind of treat as part of the extended family. So extended families would also be this source of kind of emotional and practical support in people's lives.
Right. Talk about the nuclear family a little bit, because that's something that certainly in conservative circles, there's a lot of argument that we need that. That is necessary and vital to sort of a functioning society. But I'm curious how much, and I would say typically that's also been a heterosexual nuclear family has been their argument. I think many have softened on that to some extent anyway. But is there any data to support that? Is there any science behind that? Is there any validity to the idea that it's always been that way for thousands of years? And and how much of it is cultural too? I think we sometimes get locked into the United States and this is how it is here, where I don't know that that's true in other parts of the world.
Yeah. This is recent history in the like long scheme of human life. So if we're talking about, for instance, like specifically raising kids, that there's a very esteemed anthropologist, Sarah Hrdy, who has said that without alloparents, there would not be a human species. Concept of alloparents. So parents are they are usually the biological parents of the offspring, and alloparents are like anybody else who is helping to raise children. And so Sarah Hrdy says that without alloparents, there would never have been a human species. I mean, she also talks. Anyway, I don't need to go too far down it, but she looks at the ways that children have been raised by whole groups of people. And there's there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that did a really close ethnography of a hunter-gatherer community in the Congo, and found that on average babies had 8 caregivers other than the mother who was doing hands-on care. So like feeding, soothing, other sorts of very, very intensive activities. And then beyond that, they had a lot of other caregivers. So, and that's sort of a good example of the ways people have been living for a long, long time. And you don't even have to look that far back in history or that far afield. I mean, when I speak to friends who have, whose families have immigrated from a place like India, they are used to a joint family, kind of household, where they're either sharing a house where they're next door to their uncles and aunts, and they are being raised with their cousins. And the people that they call their cousins might not actually even be biologically their cousins. They're really just sort of friends of the family. But in places outside of the U.S., you see a lot of these sort of larger family structures. And then to the question of, science, is this better? From the vantage point of children and children's well-being, which I think matters a lot. What longitudinal research has shown, like looking at the psychological well-being of kids, is that family structure it does not really correlate with outcomes for kids on those sorts of metrics. What does is stability and the sort of like loving care that's coming from the adults. And there are many different ways that can look. So I think that the nuclear family is one image of what a stable, supportive, loving household can look like. But there are other ways that you can get that stability. And I think there's been sort of increasing recognition that the nuclear family standing alone can be quite fragile. And that's, what I've heard from the experts I've talked to, and that having more people who are involved in supporting the parents and helping raise the kids can make everybody stronger. I mean, this is very analogous to what we were talking about earlier, that instead of seeing, the smallest possible unit, like in a romantic partnership, or in this case, the family is better, sometimes it actually, you want to have a wider safety net of people who are there.
On the X is brought to you by Mechanix Wear. Mechanix Wear gloves are kind of the go-to glove, I think, for most people out there, whether it's working around the house or on the job or some kind of tactical setting. That's certainly been the case for me throughout my life, and they've made a whole bunch of improvements to the gloves that they have out there. So they've got the kind of original series here with the Velcro backing, Velcro close that most people can use in sort of everyday settings, very ubiquitous for various things that you might want to do. Then they've got these fast fit ones, which you essentially just slide on. There's a little loop there around the wrist where you can pull them on. And then they've got the Impact series, which has a reinforced backing to protect your knuckles. And then they've got this lock ring reinforcement around the thumb now, where there's a lot of wear and tear. There's a whole bunch of other improvements to these, and if you go to their website, they literally have a 5 to 7 minute video about each one of these sets of gloves and all the improvements they've made, from the material, reducing the seams, making them more reinforced, making them more moisture wicking. It's clear that they put a lot of care and attention into their gloves, and if you listen to the guy talk on the website, they really love gloves, and I think that comes out in everything they do. When I'm going out to a hardware store and I'm looking for some gloves, I almost look at everything else as just kind of a cheap knockoff. So definitely my go-to glove, highly recommended. Mechanix Wear gloves. They're available at most retailers on mechanixwear.com and GSA Advantage, and they're proud to offer an exclusive 15% off discount through the ID.me program to military veterans and first responders. So check them out. Let's talk about romantic partner, because I want to ask this question because it made me think reading the book. Yeah, how do you define that? So how do we define a romantic partner? Is it literally just a best friend, maybe among many, who you have sex with, or is there something else to it?
Yeah, I mean, I like spent an entire chapter trying to answer this question because it's like it's not an easy one, and that is a proposal that I've heard from some people. And basically, the conclusion I come to is that when people are referring to a romantic relationship, let's say there are like 3 romantic relationships that you're looking at of people in the same room. There's going to be a lot of overlap, but there's also going to be a lot of differences. And we are, it's like you have to check some, but not every box. And some of those boxes might be that there's a sexual relationship, but there might not be. I mean, like one of the stereotypes of both aging and people having kids is that like their sex lives disappear. So, like an active sex life is not actually a requirement. Some people have a lower sex drive or, don't experience sexual attraction, but they can still have a romantic relationship. So sex, it's like a lot of the times, but not always, in terms of like passion. I've seen very passionate romantic relationships, and I've also seen ones that are really companionate. And again, another kind of stereotype is that as people get, go longer into their relationships, that it comes to resemble a sort of tender, have friendship elements and the companionship, and it might not have those fits of passion. I think there is a kind of conjoining of lives that people have, and that might be, one of the more significant shared things. But early in a romantic relationship, you don't actually know like what the outcome's going to be. You could be broken up in 2 weeks, or you could be living together for 30 years. So the things that to me, the part of what is important about defining a romantic relationship is it feels important to know what a romantic relationship is when we're trying to understand why is it held in higher esteem than friendships and other kinds of relationships. And the best kind of explanation I could come to is that people see romantic relationships as building toward a shared future. And that one of the differences when you go on a date, first date with somebody versus go on a first friend date or friend hangout, is that in a romantic relationship, it's if you are, or in the romantic context, if you are looking for a relationship and not something that's sort of more casual, you are expected to kind of evaluate, can I see myself with this person? And that's what you're doing on date after date. And you're thinking about the future very actively, and that you are going to intertwine your lives. And with friends, it's a lot looser. And I mean, what I'm showing, I think, in the book is that it is very possible to intertwine your lives, and it is possible to build that future together in the way that romantic partners do. But that's not the sort of standard trajectory. So I think it can make sense for people to say, well, like this thing that has the potential to be really meaningful and drive a lot of your decisions in your life, like that's important. But I think the reality is that a lot of romantic relationships end, and that the relationships that are more durable might be your sister, your brother, your parents, your friends. That they're the ones around picking you up when romantic partnerships dissolve.
Yeah, but how would you? I agree with all that. How would you define romance without sex? Though I'm trying to figure this out in my own head, really. Because let me just give some sort of concrete examples, I guess. My wife and I could grow to 80 years old and we don't have sex anymore or whatever, like hypothetically, right? But I would still, I guess, consider that a romantic relationship. There's a romantic feeling there that, and it's not just about sort of intertwined lives and kids and shared experiences and everything. There's like still it's still a feeling, right? Mm-hmm. That's very hard to define. That's very hard to kind of bring into existence and articulate. At the same time, I can say I've got friends and teammates from my time in the military, from other places, guys, as a heterosexual male, that I say, I love you. Like, I love those guys. And I definitely feel that way, but I don't feel romantic about them. Right. Mm-hmm. So these are people, all these people that I can say I love, but there's almost like only one case where it's like romance. And but I have a tough time putting my finger on what that means.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I could ask questions about it, but I got about, what are the distinctions? I think maybe there's some might be about like, who do you feel comfortable engaging in physical touch with? One thing that I do think is a common distinction with romance versus platonic relationships is, do you celebrate the relationship? Do you treat the relationship as its own entity, like you celebrate anniversaries, and you nurture it rather than, you celebrate, like like one example is that I think it's different to celebrate a person's birthday rather than to celebrate an anniversary. And with some of with M, for instance, we celebrate the anniversary of our friendship, which feels like a way that you are treating the relationship, this platonic one, as something that you like are preserving. So I think that might be a distinction compared to the other, to the friends that you're talking about. But one point of all this is like that the lines are kind of blurry, and that what we think of as these very distinct kinds of relationships have some overlap, and that's okay. Like, that's okay. I think that's and that's interesting. And one of the ways that I got into this whole project was because I saw that I had these romantic elements with my friend M, but I didn't want to be in a conventional romantic relationship with her. We didn't have sexual attraction to each other, but the kind of affection that we have felt like it had these elements of romance. And when I was looking at history, these very emotionally intimate friendships I was referring to earlier are called romantic friendships. Like, that's the label that. So there is just this blurring of lines that's possible, and that I, if nothing else, I think romance and sex do not always have to go together, and people understand that you can have I think for a lot of people, they understand the idea of a one night stand. So you could have sex without romance, but it is also possible to have the reverse, and we just have to maybe be able to live in the gray a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, for sure, that's true. There can be sex without love, sex without romance, but I mean, I just had never considered how hard it is to articulate that term, really, to like bring it into existence, to kind of reify it in a way where it's like, well, what does that actually look like? What does it mean? How do I make that concrete? I don't know. It's really a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's like the intertwined lives, shared future, celebrating. That's that's like the best thing I can kind of come up with, and that there's going to be a lot of variation, but people disagree. And but I think it's interesting to realize that something that a term we use all the time, and a classification that we never seem to, never take time to define, but treat as so important and like worth as more than everything else. If you actually try to define it, it's pretty hard.
It is, yeah. So is our emphasis then on kind of marriage or that type of relationship, certainly in our society now, and the importance of it, has that now degraded our other significant others, those relationships, in some way? Or is it making those relationships more prone to degradation in some way?
I do think that if you expect your romantic partner to be your best friend, it does not leave a lot of room for a best friend or for other, friends in your life. So, I think a consequence of really the sort of ballooning expectations of romance has had these negative knockoff effects. I do see the tide changing a little bit. That there has been so much sort of mainstream discussion about this idea that, to quote the psychologist Esther Perel, we now expect of one person what we used to expect of a village. And she also talks about the sort of fragility of that. And I see, I just see in the course of the time that I've been reporting on friendship that it is being taken seriously much more, both for its own sake and because people realize that it's not great for a romantic relationships. There's, psychological research to bear out people's marriages seem to be better when they have other people to rely on. So I do see things improving. But yeah, I think when you sort of ratchet up what we expect of spouses, it leaves less time in our lives for our friends, and it also fosters this kind of competitive mentality that we were talking about. That anything that the spouse is not doing, or is not, or anything you're doing away from your spouse, anything you're getting away from them, is necessarily taking away from the marriage rather than neutral or positive.
Yeah. Are there specific things though that we should, I mean, I don't want to break this down into like, okay, I've got a checklist to go find a best friend kind of thing. Hopefully, I think throughout our lives, when we have friends or very close friends, you fall into it naturally. It's like you're not looking for something specific, but you have fun together. You sort of, whatever it may be, you complete each other's sentences, or you just like the same types of things. But are there categories of things that, or needs that are satisfied there, where it does take some of the pressure off of like the romantic relationship? It seems to me like the one thing that's like off the table is sex. It's like, okay, your partner, spouse, whatever. It's like, that's the one thing off the table. It's only here, but everything else is sort of open for someplace else to either augment or get in, you don't get enough of whatever that may be, emotional support or something. So are there sort of categories where you look at like, these are the things that a friend really brings to the table to make it all better for everybody?
I mean, I think it's probably going to depend on the person, but what I saw is that friends can be the person that you live with long term. I read about people who are raising kids with their friends, who are each other's caregivers. Sometimes they have spouses, and sometimes it is primarily the friendship. I mean, I think one area, or maybe a couple areas that feel like it doesn't hurt to have multiple people, is having someone that you have as a confidant. I especially think about people in romantic partnerships who don't have anybody that they can talk to other than their romantic partner about like the deepest things in their life. I just wonder if they're struggling in their romantic relationship, as an example, who do they go to talk about that? I mean, if if there's just anything that maybe they feel like they have a hard time sharing with a romantic partner, that they're, I don't know, embarrassed about, it really helps to have more than one person who can give you perspective, who you feel safe with. And I think that's just sort of all around a good thing. And it can come up in sort of much more mundane ways too. Like when I've had a difficult thing that I need help with, or an exciting piece of news that I want to share, there have been times where my husband wasn't available, but somebody else was, whether it was, a housemate or a close friend. And knowing that I am not reliant on the constant availability for this one person, if anything comes up, I think is all around good. And another is, it helps to have more than one person that you trust to care for you. I'm thinking about Em when I was sick, and she would come over and kind of make a concoction that had like a ton of lemon juice. It was very sour, and tea and ginger and honey. And it was really nice to have more than in one, because my husband wasn't nearby, but even when he later was, just having more than one person that you can lean on. So I think having people in your life who are not just there to have, get coffee or play soccer with, like have fun with, but are also going to show up when you need some caregiving. Like that's also something to look out for.
Yeah. Is this harder to do these days though? Like with our sort of digital landscape and being in front of computers most of the day and remote work, all of that?
I do think that there are real challenges, and I think one comes from people is that there's a technology part, and we have the kind of facsimile of relationships when they're coming through text, and sometimes those are very helpful, but it helps to be present with people, to notice the expression on someone's face, or they're carrying too many bags and you want to help out, or just a friend who was single parent, solo parenting for a little bit while her husband was traveling for work. And I wanted to offer to be helpful with the kids. And I'm like, I don't live nearby. Like, you actually need somebody who can be close enough by to help. So I think as people distribute to places farther from their friends. And there's just sort of a lot of mobility now in the country. Yeah, that also makes things more challenging.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed just in my own life is as I'm sure this is true with a lot of people, you go through life and you sort of have different phases where you have friends, probably a couple very close friends. I can think of going all the way back to as far as I can remember, like grade school, the guys I hung out with all the time. And then you go off to, maybe you move, you do something like that, or you go off to college. And maybe you keep in touch with those people, but in a lot of cases it kind of fades because now you're not together and you're not having a shared experience anymore, and you make new friends there. But then you graduate from college and you go on to the next thing. And so I can sort of think through these phases of my life where I have very close friends that most of them I'm still in some kind of contact with, but we're certainly not communicating with all the time. But certain groups of them, when we get together occasionally, it's almost like no time has passed and we can just kind of go right back into that. And I do feel that way, certainly about some of those groups specifically, like my buddies from college, close buddies there. We get together, we'll stay up till 4 a.m. just talking. And to your point, can talk about just about anything, I think. And it's all good and it's really enjoyable. But it's interesting to me where we'll then go months or maybe even a year where we barely communicate with one another. And I miss that in kind of, if you come into some place as an adult where you don't have some kind of shared experience with people, you can make friends and people you talk with, but you can kind of miss out on that real deep friendship, wherever that line gets crossed. I don't know where it is.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about your last question was kind of like, at this moment in our history, is it difficult? But then there are the questions about at different moments in life, what what is easier or harder? And I wrote a piece a few years ago about what adults can learn from kids' friendships, which came from me talking to a woman who was around 30 and had these extremely close friendships when she was with these two other young girls at the time in middle school and high school, and then felt like by comparison, adult friendship doesn't do it for her because it's just like people catching up after long stretches of time and they're just talking, whereas she and her friends had all these shared experiences. And they, traded these like notebooks back and forth between class, and they came up with rituals, and they had a whole kind of, she described it as a friendship culture. And I think for a lot of people, childhood and through, if you go to college, the college years are kind of the heyday of close friendship. And part of that is, proximity. You have a ton of time together, and you're also experiencing things that you can then call back to that become these touchstones as memories. And I think that in the busyness of people's lives and in the prioritization of family and romantic partners, that there are fewer opportunities for people to really have those memories. I mean, one example that comes to mind for me is real estate. Well, the backstory is maybe not that important, but it was a real estate agent who was talking about how he sort of envies like the idea of living near your friends because his friends would respond to him when he reached out to hang out like, well, don't you love your wife and kids? And if you are can't imagine if that's their reaction to hanging out, in a general way. Yeah. If he suggested like, let's go on a vacation, that his friends would be okay with that. And I think for a lot of people, the reverse might be that the romantic partner might not think it's important enough or like want to go themselves. And I've seen sort of cases of this, but you really, to build closeness, you need to carve out time, and it really helps to not just be having a conversation, as much as I love deep conversation, but also being out in the world and having those sorts of experiences. And I think in order for that to happen, people need to realize it's something that is worth cultivating and making some, taking away some time from other things. And the last thing I'll say is that I talked to a psychologist who talked about the kind of core ingredients of attachment relationships. So classic attachment relationship is parent-child, also, romantic partners, but you can have a platonic attachment relationship. So like somebody who you feel emotionally attached to. And the three ingredients that she talked about were time, togetherness, and touch. And if you think about over the course of your life, like, you get a lot of time and togetherness when you're younger. Touch is, you have kids tumbling over each other. Physical affection, I think, particularly with young women, is really accepted, and that sort of falls away as we get older. And if you can, then you can sort of reverse engineer close friendships if you think about how do I get those ingredients.
Yeah, talk about the gender differences here in terms of, again, not romantic relationships, but just sort of platonic, whatever you want to call it, friendship relationships, because there are some there, certainly from a societal perspective. And again, some of this is cultural, right? This is Western culture, but of what's acceptable. To your point, you sort of brought it up there. I think there is some physical affection that is acceptable for women, generally speaking, in just friendship type relationships that potentially isn't there for men traditionally.
Yeah, I mean, there are big differences, I think, now with women and men's friendships. And for men, you can look at stats on men are much less likely to tell their friend they love them. They're much less likely to have their friend be their closest confidant, and more likely to say their romantic partner. Men are often relying on the women in their lives to organize their social lives. And there are just a lot of different kinds of barriers in the way. I mean, there's a recent beautiful piece in the New York Times Magazine about the sort of decline of male friendship from the perspective of a man who's like in his 40s, and just found that even when he was sort of seeking company and he turned to podcasts, and a lot of like male-oriented podcasts or sort of targeted toward them, that all of the rhetoric was about kind of making yourself more fit and making yourself more disciplined, and it was all very like self-improvement and not about connection. So it's just so kind of in the ether, I think, of the way that boys and men are told like this is what it means to have a good life. And I think that there's much more emphasis on connection in the way that women are socialized. One of the most remarkable parts of the research for me was seeing how historically recent this all is. I mean, let alone the cultural differences. Like, you can still go to plenty of countries and you'll see, men holding hands. That doesn't have. There isn't the kind of specter of homosexuality hanging over that. We can, get into why that's the case. But they're just. It's so interesting to look at photos from like the turn of the 20th century, and you see men like totally entangled with each other. Or you can read letters from the time of the founding of the U.S. and men will say things like, the last vibrations of my heart will vibrate for you. That there's, certainly there's some fraction of these men who were sexually interested in each other, and the kind of concepts of that we have now around sexuality didn't exist in quite the same way. But I think it would be wrong to say that is the case for all of them. And then it was just normal to have a lot of that kind of close male intimacy. And, as we were talking about earlier with, you have like Montaigne, this philosopher, saying only men can have true friendship. And you have similar kind of thinking about the capacity for close friendship that's possible among men in, ancient Rome. And men would talk about their friends as the other half of their soul, like really the soulmate language that you were mentioning earlier, that would be applied to men. So yes, there are real divergences now in the experiences of particularly straight men and women in the U.S. But it does not have to be this way. It isn't this way everywhere, and it hasn't always been this way even in the U.S.
Yeah. What's interesting though is I feel like it's changing a little bit. Like I will say for guys my age that are in have come from kind of very alpha type professions, it's almost like we emerge on the other side and we're like, hey, we need to soften up a little bit. I don't think we do this consciously, but in much more of a way than I ever did before, I tell other guys that I love them, and they will say the same thing to me, from my former profession or even just outside of that. There's also a lot more hugging amongst guys now than I remember growing up. Like, maybe I blocked this out, but when I was a kid, I don't remember adult men ever hugging one another. They shook hands. That was about it. But I hugged other dudes all the time now. Like, we do this sort of handshake hug thing, or even just hug one another. And it's totally, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like, it just feels like that's changed a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, there are a few different directions my mind's going in. One is on the point of like, do you want to have, is it okay to have other people in your life who are fulfilling needs that you usually give to your romantic partner? Like, it would be very sad for me if the only person my husband hugged was me.
Yes,
Like,
for sure.
you know, and you know, we are mammals. Like, we need physical contact, and it seems absolutely wild to me that it is not a bigger part of most men's lives, that they're dependent on a romantic relationship for that. And then with the kind of cultural piece that you're talking about with men, you know, what do they feel comfortable with? It reminds me of somebody I wrote about in the book, named Nick, who grew up in a conservative Christian family, and he himself is a pastor. And he had all these kind of blockages in his mind around what was acceptable for a man to do with another man. He's straight, but he, you know, was afraid that people would think that he was gay if he had his friend put his arm around him, and just sort of like needed to essentially deprogram himself. And his very close friend helped him think through, am I uncomfortable? Like, for what reasons am I uncomfortable with this? And they came up with these set of questions. What is moral? What is cultural? And what is personal? And, you know, for instance, having one man's hand around the other's shoulder, and they're, again, you know, in this kind of conservative Christian milieu, having been trained as pastors. And there's nothing kind of, morally wrong about a man having his arm around somebody else's shoulder, they decided. Culturally, Nick realized, like, yeah, he'd never seen his dad, I don't think had hugged him really. Even when he would spend time with his dad, if they were sitting on a couch, he would leave space in between them. And he realized sort of the culture of his family cultivated this idea that, men shouldn't get close to each other. And then there was a personal question, like, did he personally feel uncomfortable, like physically, with having his friend's hand on his shoulder? And it was like, no, he didn't. So it's an example of like the level of absorption that I think a lot of men have taken in, and how much intention it requires to undo what men have absorbed from around them about what is okay. And in the end, Nick has this extremely close friend now, who he, considers a brother to him and as part of his family. And that would not have been possible if he had kept the walls up that had felt to him so crucial to remain there.
Right. Do you have a hard stop in 5 minutes?
I can go over. Yeah. Okay.
Because there's a couple other things that I definitely want to get to. So let me get there. Let's talk about the institution of marriage itself, because you sort of question, should we even have it in here? Which is actually, it's something I've thought of as well. Is sort of, there's a couple of questions around this. This is a huge topic, and you're probably talking for an hour on this alone. But how do we properly define it? What does that entail? Because I think you can go a bunch of different directions there, from sort of a commitment perspective, from a legal perspective. I mean, a lot of it just has to do with the legalities around it. And then what's the utility of it? Like, do we even need it? And let me just couch that a little bit from my own perspective, is like, I'm married. I've been married for going on 22 years, happily married. I like being married. I wouldn't change that. It's given me a beautiful family, and I greatly love and enjoy my wife, and I wouldn't change any of that. But then her sister, she and her partner I guess. They've been together for almost as long, have a child, and they're not married. And I don't know that if they were married, it would change anything about the way they operate, the way they raise their daughter. Nothing. Like, so literally, and that's a heterosexual relationship as well. Like the difference between my wife and I and her sister and her, I guess, common law husband basically is literally just the legal paperwork that we've kind of done. And if you removed it in one case or added it in the other case, I don't know it would change anything about the way we operate. So just talk about, you obviously thought a lot about this and have gone deep on the rabbit hole talking to people about this because it affects people too. You have stories in here of people end of life scenarios where people aren't legally entitled to things, where it's like, who are you? Are you a family member? Are you a spouse? No, well, get out of the room. That kind of thing, which is tragic. So talk about how all your research and interviews has shaped your perspective on what do we do about marriage?
Yeah, I came into this thinking I was writing a book about friendship, and you can't really write a book about friendship without writing a book about marriage too, because that is, the context that determines what is the significance of friendship, and it really, there are these bigger questions that come from what relationships do we value, how do we value them, and why. And the thing I've come to take issue with is what I call the marriage monopoly. It's not that like I'm telling everybody to not get married. I'm married. I've officiated a wedding. I'm officiating 2 more this year. Like I'm not, anti-marriage, but what I do see a lot of issues with is having this singular model that our entire legal structure and our infrastructure, really, like our housing, our zoning is built around, and that for so many people, marriage, if it happens at all, is a temporary relationship in their lives because they survive their spouse, maybe the relationship ends. And what I was seeing is that we only have this one model. And you are fresh out of luck if the person that you really care for is your sibling or is your friend and they end up in the hospital. I mean, I write about these 2 women who have been best friends for 50 years. They have lived together for the last 25 years. They're now in their 80s, go to the same primary care doctor. Their lives are kind of totally intertwined. And when one of them ended up in the emergency room, the friend was not allowed to ride in the ambulance. She was not allowed into to see her friend in the hospital initially, even though she had medical and legal power of attorney rights. So they had tried a workaround. Eventually, she was able to get in, but she because she had that medical power of attorney rights. But what that shows is that, okay, if you have money and you are creative, you can sort of can contract around the absence of marriage. But you will not have a status that is recognized, especially in these crucial moments. And it was like the most kind of emotionally difficult moments in people's lives that this stuff came up. When someone was getting cancer treatment, when someone was on their deathbed, when someone is, trying to figure out who are they bequeathing their money to. So, what I think it's really the monopoly part that's the issue. And then there's the question of what should legal marriage entail if we're going to have marriage. And there are more than 1,000 rights and benefits on the federal level that are attached to marriage in addition to state ones, which some of which, I think make sense if you're like, we want to encourage stability in the relationship, but a lot of them are not necessarily related. And so one thing I've seen from legal experts is like, well, we can strip down marriage so that it only has the things that are encouraging, economic interdependence and, stability and caregiving. Like those seem to be the things there. So there's the stripped down marriage option. And then there's create legal alternatives to marriage so that if you don't want to get married or you don't have a marriage-like relationship, like if you are 2 siblings, you can't get married. That's like not gonna, and there have been legal cases on this, like in in Europe, for instance, that there should be some way that is straightforward for you to get legal recognition. And I think it would help on a societal level to have some language around, I guess we have like next of kin, but something that maybe sounds a little more formal. And then there's just various solutions to this that would make it so that the different kinds of relationships that matter to people's lives would be understood by the state and sort of socially affirmed.
Yeah. But do we need it? I think
do we need marriage at all?
Yeah. Do we need it at all?
You're like, it's interesting. Like you're pushing me to like go further than I even go in the book, partly because I'm like, well, I'm living in the researchers I was talking to are like, we're living in like the world of the real here. And I don't see marriage being dismantled anytime soon.
I don't either, but
as a thought experiment, I mean, maybe a different way to think about this is like, a way that somebody posed a similar question to me was like, if we were aliens arriving on Earth and we wanted to kind of design a great life, like what would it look like? And would it resemble what we have now? And I think that there is something about commitment that is really desirable for a lot of people. But my guess is that commitment can look like different things. It might not look like to one person. I mean, that is a relatively recent. It might not be for the entire life. That's also, people's lifespans are a lot longer now. A marriage in the colonial period was going to last, I think, like 16 years, whatever. Like it's not on average. Now we expect it to be. You've outstripped probably a colonial marriage if my recollection is right. So yeah, it might not be the whole span of life. It might be that you can unbundle some of these things that in our conception of marriage that is enshrined in the law. It is expected to be a sexual relationship, and you can. I mean, I think in a lot of states you can sort of file for divorce with the basis of like you're not having sex anymore. So I think it's possible that the thing we would create would unbundle some of these aspects. So I mean, I think probably we like marriage as it is now, you are committed to one person only, and which means sexual fidelity, maybe and sort of there's no other relationship that even vies for the same level of significance. Like, yeah, I think we probably don't need it to look like that.
Yeah. Because I just often wonder, I don't understand why the government should have any say in who I have sex with, who I have a relationship with. I just don't understand. Certainly I approach that from a libertarian kind of perspective of like, how is that the government's business? Now, don't get me wrong. I like the tax benefits of it. Like there's certain things that the law grants me, but I still don't feel like it's anybody's business but my own. I mean, to me, this is one of these things where I've never understood. Maybe I don't understand why anybody cares who anybody else marries, whether their sexual orientation, like none of that to me is like, it has nothing to do with me. I don't understand why anybody cares about any of that.
Yeah. I mean, that is certainly the perspective of people that I spoke to for the book. I think if you can look at the history of marriage and how it's sort of entangled in this state, and some of it, there might be arguments that are compelling, like when we start to have more social policies, like something like Social Security in the U.S., to figure out who's eligible. If you have this like breadwinner caregiver set up, and then marriage becomes this kind of, and let's say the vast majority of people are married, marriage becomes this kind of proxy for a caregiving, dependent relationship. So, if the husband passes away, that the woman, even though she wasn't earning an income, was clearly like enabling him to work, and she was not. There was sort of dependence there, and the state is kind of replacing the breadwinner. Like there's situations like that where you can see why it would be helpful for a state to have some kind of way of understanding what's going on within relationships if it wants to support people. But one of the observations from kind of legal scholars looking at this is just that it's not a good proxy at this point. I mean, so many people aren't married, so it's leaving a lot of people out. There's so much variety in the ways that relationships are structured. And also, as I was saying earlier, like a lot of the benefits attached to marriage don't necessarily have to do with something like financial interdependence. And there are just other ways you can get at that. Like, you know, an example is the worker compensation policy in California. You don't have, the latest of my understanding was that, you know, marital status isn't the thing that helps you determine like if you're survivor benefits for like workers' compensation stuff, but whether you are dependent on the worker. And like there are just other ways to show that. And I think people want shortcuts, and the state needs shortcuts. There's a whole body of political science about the state wanting to be able to put people in boxes for kind of to understand the population. But I just think marriage is not always working the way that maybe people think it is efficient.
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, right? Like, I don't know that I have the answers to any of this stuff, but it is something that I think if you really question some of it, it's difficult. It's hard to sort of say, okay, yeah, why do we do that? Why do we have to have that? Where should the lines be? What benefits should that entail here? Mm-hmm. So of all the kind of the other significant other relationships that you explored in this book, was there one or were there a few where it really highlighted a very big gaping hole or flaw in the kind of the traditional setup we have now in that regard, or something where it's just like, yeah, that's really messed up because, you know, for these people? I
mean, I feel like the book is structured where each chapter is really focusing on one set of people. And I think each of those sets of people is revealing something that we maybe take for granted as normal, but actually we should question, and maybe in showing us a different way. Like, but one that I'll highlight is these two close friends. One of them is named Joy, and she took care of her friend who was battling ovarian cancer for years. Her name is Hannah. And that entailed like flying out to another part of the country for Hannah to get specialized treatment. And she, during all that time, was not entitled to family medical leave because her friend was unrelated to her. Right. And then when her friend died, she was not entitled to bereavement leave. And the people, beyond sort of the legal parts of it, the people around her didn't totally understand the significance of the loss in her life. And I will tell you that when I do in-person events, I know at this point that there's someone who's going to cry. They're going to come up to me. They're going to tell me a story of loss in their friendship, whether it was the loss that happened through death or like some kind of falling out in the friendship, and that they have felt really alone in that. And that to me, that tells us, one, that the depth of the loss is an indication of how important the relationship is. So that should make it really clear that friendships can be so powerful in people's lives. But then there's, the difficulty that people face isn't just the loss, which on its own is very hard, but the feeling that it's not legitimate and they don't have support around them. I think we really see the relationships we value when they go away, and how people either step up and say that's a big deal and I will help you, or ignore it or belittle it. So I think that like Joy and Hannah's story very much stands out to me, as do like the other examples of loss that I've encountered. Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting about that too, I remember that story very significantly, but is that, and this isn't the case necessarily in that story, but if you think about that scenario, right? Somebody's dying. They've got a spouse. She had a child, at least one child. I think it was like kind of 11 years old when she died. But you could have a scenario where someone could be married, but it's not a loving relationship. They're just they're still married on paper. And yet, to your point, the spouse would be entitled to all these things, and the person they really care about, who's really there for them, gets none of it. Right? Which again just points to, we've got this thing set up where it's like, well, if you have this piece of paper and this contract, then you get all this stuff, regardless of how you're actually acting on it. Yeah. I mean, it's like the distinction between form and function, which is something else that came up when I was talking to legal scholars about this, that there's so much emphasis on structure and the label and not what's happening inside the relationship. And it's more complicated when you look inside the relationship. And so, I guess people they want shortcuts. But if you actually look inside, you can see just how, the closest and most important relationships in people's lives can be all different types. And it would really benefit us to see that variety rather than think there's only one option, which also is just sort of less flexible to the kind of vagaries of life.
Yeah, for sure. I think we'll end it there, Rhaina. Thank you so much for coming on. It's really fascinating stuff. I enjoyed it. And there's a lot of questions in here that, to your point, I just think are really hard to answer, but they're very important to think about. And like reading through these various scenarios with people, it just reinforced to me, we just have to do a better job of just letting people live their lives and have the relationships they want to have, whatever those look like, and respect them. I think too often these days we get too wrapped up in caring how consenting adults want to have a relationship, whatever that looks like, is their business. I just don't understand why we care what they're doing.
I don't know. I mean, it is a very pluralistic vision. Like, I'm not telling people don't get married, don't have romantic relationships, they're bad, or you need to have this kind of friendship. It's like there are just different ways people live. And to me, the kind of stunning and very moving thing is that these people have found these friendships even with everything in society working against them. They have, no encouragement, and yet they are still working. Like, imagine what would happen if we didn't have all these blockages in the way and people had more opportunities to really get close to a variety of people. Yeah, for sure. Okay. Well, thank you again for coming on. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
Anything else on this that we didn't touch on real quick, or ways that people can connect with you?
I mean, people can find me on the internet. My name's unusual, so I'm easy to find, like at Rhaina Cohen on Instagram. I have a Substack. I work at NPR, but also write more often on this topic for The Atlantic. I had a recent piece out that's about parents who are raising their kids alongside their friends.
Thanks for listening to On the X, the official podcast of the Navy SEAL Foundation and an Ironclad original series sponsored by Mechanix Wear. Learn more at NavySealFoundation.org or text On the X to 60104 to join our subscriber list. See you next time.